Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the September 2021 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Through Dictatorship to Democracy by Clara Zetkin from 1919. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting us on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So, this file was first published in English as a pamphlet in Glasgow by Socialist Labour Press in about 1929. However, the pamphlet is believed to have been written again in about 1919. It was translated by Eden and Cedar Paul, transcribed by Ted Crawford, and marked up by Ida O'Callaghan for the Marxists Internet Archive at marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this file and thousands of other free Marxist texts. Please go check them out. I'd also just like to note that this is a response to Karl Kautsky's Democracy versus Dictatorship, which was a criticism of the fledgling Soviet Russia at that time. If you're interested in this subject, also going up on the channel here at Socialism for All this month is a longer work by Lenin from 1918, The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. That is also entry number 8 in the basic Marxism-Leninism curriculum that we have been doing in slow motion with many side readings such as this to fill in the gaps and, do other enrichment along the way. Alright, let's get into the audiobook. In a recent article entitled Democracy versus Dictatorship, Comrade Kautsky opposed the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry as it has been established in Russia by the Bolshevist overthrow of the state authority. He expressed his dissent from the views of those socialists who have contended that in existing circumstances, this dictatorship is historically justified. Substantially, Kautsky's opinions are identical with those recently published by Martov, a Menshevik comrade, in his writing, Marx and the Problem of the Dictatorship of the Proletariat. My answer to Kautsky's criticism of the Bolsheviks runs as follows. Bolshevism and the strong hand. The use of the strong hand is the essential characteristic of Bolshevist activity. This is not ideal, but unavoidable. It may be contrary to the prescriptions of democracy, and yet it subserves the interests of democracy. If, for all who live in Russia, democracy is to become an energy-diffusing socialistic reality, the Bolsheviks cannot escape the necessity of sacrificing, as a transient measure, the rights of certain individuals and of certain social groups. That this should happen is an inevitable feature of historic evolution. Democracy is of a twofold nature, being simultaneously means and end of historic evolution. The dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry in Russia bears the insignia of this contradiction. Plaintive voices from Russia, the criticisms uttered by the adversaries of Bolshevism in other lands, assure us that since the Bolsheviks attained to power, they have everywhere infringed and sacrificed democratic principles. Democracy, we're told, has repeatedly been given the go-by in the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, in the deprivations of civil rights announced in the Soviet Constitution, and in the declaration of the mass terror. Doubtless, but without such infringements, could the revolution have been saved? Could it have been carried a stage further? Could the revolutionists have continued to work for socialism, which alone guarantees democracy for all? This is the crucial question, and for me the answer is self-evident, considering the circumstances attendant upon the Russian Revolution. Dissolution of the Constituent Assembly. I hold that the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, far from involving a sacrifice of democracy, made democracy more effective. No doubt, that assembly had been elected upon the basis of a democratic suffrage, but the elections had taken place before the bourgeois watchwords, and the bourgeois socialist program of compromise had lost all their allurements for the broad masses of the workers. They had taken place before the decisive historic moment in which the November Revolution and the acceptance of the Soviet government by the organized workers, peasants, and soldiers had effectively condemned as partial and inadequate the programs of the two opening phases of the revolution and of the parties that had put these programs forward. It should be added that during the opening periods, the economic and social power of the possessing classes was still sufficient to exercise considerable influence upon the electoral results. the Constituent Assembly could not possibly be regarded as an unfalsified expression of the opinions and the will of the workers. Insofar as in Russia we can speak of a popular will, that will was indubitably incorporated in the decisions of the Soviets. Was the Provisional Soviet government to abdicate its real power in favor of the will-o'-the-wisp democracy of the Constituent Assembly? Was the Soviet government to entrust the work of revolution to bourgeois hands, to hands that were itching to fetter, nay, to strangle, this unruly intruder? Or was power to be handed over to the social revolutionaries, who had proved too weak to protect the revolution? To take such a step would have been no less foolish than criminal. Revolutionary wine and parliamentary bottles. There's another point to consider. The revolution had not arrested its progress at the goal of a bourgeois revolution. Transcending any such aim, it had revealed the titanic figure of a proletarian revolution, of one aiming at socialistic reorganization. Had they accepted parliamentarism, the Bolsheviks would have accepted an institution which, however important, is of very limited value, an institution which, even in times of peaceful evolution, has proved obviously inadequate to the needs of the proletarian struggle for emancipation, an institution which, adapted to the requirements of the capitalist order, must necessarily fail to meet the necessities of those whose purpose it is to subvert that order. It is undeniable that the proletariat must derive all the advantage that can be derived from parliamentary institutions. But Parliament is one of those state institutions which a victorious proletariat cannot simply take over and use for its own purposes. The new revolutionary wine must not be poured into old bottles. From this outlook, Bolshevism was assuredly justified in replacing the Constituent Assembly by the Soviets, in replacing the activity of a determinative and legislative assembly by the activity of organizations upon the broadest possible democratic basis, and simultaneously legislative, administrative, and executive. Proletarian dictatorship provisional. It is undeniable that the democracy created by the Soviet Constitution is incomplete. It is incontestable that thereby large groups of persons are excluded from the suffrage. But the critics seem to forget that these disqualifications are merely provisional, that they will be enforced solely for the period during which the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry persists and must persist. The Constitution leaves no doubt upon this matter. The dissolution of Old Russia, the coming of New Russia, are not yet so far advanced as to enable the Soviet government, with one stroke of the pen or with a single mighty blow, to abolish private ownership of the means of production. In Russia, the knell of private property has not yet sounded. The hour for the expropriation of all expropriators has not yet struck. Minorities still possess economic power and social power, can still use and misuse these powers against the overwhelming majority of the workers. Is political power to be superadded to enable them to pursue their egoistic aims in defiance of the interests of the community at large? Let us clear our minds of phrases. Let us cut loose from formalities. Let us cease to reiterate the shibboleth that the masses have the right and the power to counteract the antisocial machinations of the possessing minorities. Is it not obvious that, in reality, things will be very different until economic freedom and economic equality shall have endowed the entire nation with spiritual freedom and maturity? Who would not laugh at a military commander so unwise as to send artillery and shells as a gift to the hostile army? Yet the Bolshevists are supposed to have committed a deadly sin in that they have refused to arm and equip the reactionary minorities for the struggle against the revolution. This too at the very moment when revolution and counter-revolution were at life and death grips, when the counter-revolution was not merely supported by all the reactionary energies of Russia, but was being furnished by the Allied governments with troops, money, and moral support. Measures of military necessity. The dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, the use of forcible measures against opponents, the declaration of the mass terror, these are bitter fruits of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. They must be regarded as measures of military necessity. À la guerre comme la guerre. When you are making war, make war. The Bolshevist leaders of revolutionary Russia are engaged in a war of unparalleled significance. Here, the moral and political standards of everyday life fail us. On this colossal stage, individual measures and individual phenomena are dwarfed into insignificance. The drama is one of overwhelming historic import, and it must be accepted or rejected as a whole. Who wills the ends must not shrink from the means. A proletarian revolution aiming at socialism cannot be effected without dictatorship. Above all, this is true under existing conditions in Russia. The appeal to Marx. The ungracious critics of our Russian friends do not indeed absolutely reject dictatorship on principle. What they take amiss is the character of the dictatorship in Russia. Karl Kautsky endeavors to prove that dictatorship and democracy must go hand in hand. Just a quick comment here. This is like a year and a half after the Russian Revolution. It's kind of crazy. They were still fighting the Civil War at this point, like up through 1922. So, when you get people trying to put the cart before the horse in whatever conversations you're having, just know this has been going on like since forever. People have been trying to trip up effective revolutions. So, although the Soviet Union was destroyed after about 70 years, it lasted 70 years. So that's pretty successful. It was a major step forward for world socialism and for the body of knowledge about how to do things. So anyway, continuing. The dictatorship must not sacrifice democratic principles, but must realize them. The dictatorship must be an effluence of democracy. It must subserve the will of the majority and the interests of the majority. According to the critics, neither of these requirements is fulfilled in Russia. The small Bolshevist minority, we are told, employing brutal and forcible measures, constrains the overwhelming majority of Russians to accept Bolshevist policy. This policy, far from safeguarding the revolution, endangers the revolution. Far from advancing socialism, compromises socialism. This is the kernel of the critical onslaughts, which are directed at a mark beyond Bolshevism, which aim at clarifying, at revising, the theory of the dictatorship of the proletariat. We are given chains of logical inferences, attempts at a new outline of the concept of dictatorship, as contrasted with the old theory, which is rejected as Blanquist or Jacobin. Quick comment, there's a long anarchist argument. What's it called? It's by Anarch, A-N-A-R-K, and it's called The State is Counter-Revolutionary. Somebody asked me for a critique of that years ago. It's very long. I started watching it. It was just every hackneyed, trite argument you've ever heard, but it threw in like a 20-minute piece. Maybe it wasn't that long, but it felt that long. It was at least 10 minutes on Blanchism. Never mind that Lenin wrote against that at length, but whatever. Anyway, so yeah, this is sadly typical to this day. Continuing. The arguments are, of course, peppered with appeals to Marx and Engels and with quotations from these authors. I have carefully read the expositions, but my general outlook upon the question, upon the application of the doctrine to the special case of the Russian Revolution, and upon the part played by the Bolsheviks in that revolution, remains unchanged. As concerns the contentious questions of our own day, what does it matter whether the historic phenomena which Marx witnessed during his lifetime led him to codify his conception of the dictatorship of the proletariat? What does it matter if, having at first been inclined to a Jacobin outlook, he subsequently came rather to adopt an evolutionist and parliamentarist view? With all due deference to Comrade Martov's wide knowledge of Marxist theory, and to the indisputable acumen with which he applies that theory, we may nonetheless feel inclined to challenge his deductions, and the way in which he contrasts his interpretation of Marx with the dictatorship exercised by the Bolsheviks. But even if we believe Martov to be right concerning Marx's opinions, and concerning the applicability of those opinions to the Russian situation, there is one simple fact still to be remembered, and it is that historical evolution was not arrested when the pen fell from Marx's hand. Comment there also. So here the Bolsheviks succeed in wresting a victory from the jaws of defeat, because if you recall your history of 1917, the Tsar was overthrown in the February Revolution early in the year. And then what happened? The Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries started preparing to have the bourgeoisie take power. So they were just going to have that be, albeit a very belated, like over 100 years after the French and American revolutions, they're going to have that be Russia's bourgeois revolution and stop there. And then, who knows how long, 200 years later, maybe they could have a socialist revolution. Well, the Bolsheviks watched the Mensheviks side with the capitalists and said, oh, hell no, we're doing this now. And that's what they did. And yeah, a lot of people were mad about it, but it's okay that they were mad because the right thing happened in the end, whether or not they were mad about it. So anyway, anytime that somebody gets power and other people were fighting for that power, yeah, they're going to be mad. And they're going to give a lot of criticism that isn't necessarily totally honest. It's not necessarily totally principled. Just keep that in mind. And again, remember, what would have happened had the Bolsheviks not pressed on and led the October Revolution? Capitalism. Just regular bourgeois capitalism. No party guidance, nothing, just market anarchy. The Bolsheviks still had to help Russia develop to the point where they could do socialism. But they did it under party guidance. It's a big difference from just random anarchic bourgeois capitalism. So, anyway, continuing. The new capitalism. Since that day, the capitalist economy has not merely grown, but has exhibited entirely new phenomena of notable importance. To enumerate a few of these, we have formation of rings, trusts, and syndicates, the assumption of the premier place in industry by iron and steel products in place of textiles, the revolutionary transformation effected by improvements in electrical technology, the interlacements of industrial capital, commercial capital, and banking capital to constitute financial capital, and the worldwide dominion of the latter, etc. In the home policy and the foreign policy of all the more highly evolved states can be traced the influence of a further developed and maturer capitalism. Although on the surface, the amenities of life now seem to have improved, the class struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie has in reality been intensified. Among the struggling classes, we see a medley and a confusion of impulses towards far-reaching settlements and dread of such settlements, of great schemes and little deeds. The dominant classes are increasingly inclined to cling to the fugitive political past. We note the decay of bourgeois parliamentarism and its more and more obvious incapacity to assist the proletarian struggle for freedom toward decisive issues. Above all, we're impressed by the mighty expansion of imperialism, with its insatiable thirst for world dominion, with its overgrown armaments, its colonial undertakings, and its wars, its extremist policy of exploitation and oppression alike at home and abroad. Marxism, a progressive doctrine. Who dares maintain that, in face of the developments of the last decades, Marx, an out-and-out revolutionary thinker, would not have modified his conception of the dictatorship of the proletariat in accordance with the teaching of towering facts? If we assume Comrade Martov to be right as to the theory Marx held more than 40 years ago, can we not rest assured that Marx would have revised that theory had he been alive today? To Marx, theory was something greater than a means of elucidating the world. It was a means for transforming the world. But for this very reason, he never regarded his theories as eternal and immutable truths to which reality must conform. For him, reality always remained the object of research, the thing to be conscientiously investigated, the thing from which his theories were acquired, and in accordance with which his theories must in case of need be modified. I am confident that at this juncture, Marx's conception of the dictatorship of the proletariat would display remarkably little similarity with the meek and lowly ideal, the ideal of those who aim only at harmony and at the cooperation of all persons of, quote, goodwill, the idea which bashfully simpers at us from the expositions of the adversaries of Bolshevism. Marx's revolutionary intelligence was as keen as a sword. His heart glowed with revolutionary fire. His revolutionary will was hard as steel. Marx was ever a revolutionary fighter, a man of action, and I cannot believe that he would be found day to day among the critics of Bolshevism. On paper, the dictatorship of the proletariat and the ideal of complete democracy may be linked with this simple copula. In the world of reality, it is otherwise. The historic essence of dictatorship is dominion, stark, coercive dominion. Without infringing the rights and interests of minorities, it is as impossible as the quadrature of the circle. The historic justification of the dictatorship of the proletariat lies in this, that the dictatorship is exercised in the interests of the enormous majority of the population, and that it is no more than a means of transition, for it aims at suspending itself, at rendering itself impossible, at realizing the idea of democracy, a free people in a free land living by free labor. The perdurability of Bolshevism. Our anti-Bolsheviks deny that the extant dictatorship in Russia possesses these justifications. They declare that the Bolshevik dictatorship is the work of an inconsiderable minority of dogmatists and fanatics, who, in the interests of narrow-minded partisan conceptions and a narrow partisan policy, desire by the brutal exercise of force to constrain the enormous majority of the Russian people to swallow the Bolshevist prescriptions now and for the future. Whence do those who hold such views derive the certainty that the Bolshevist policy is that of an inconsiderable minority of Russian workers and peasants? In my opinion, the number, the loudness, and the passion of the attacks on the coercive rule of the Bolsheviks should not make us overestimate the extent or the importance of serious hostility to the policy of the Soviet government. It is an old experience, and one readily explicable, that in the struggles of faction, minorities which are greatly outnumbered are apt to display peculiar violence. It is for them a natural need to convince the world that, in spite of defeat, they have power and are in the right. Who will deny that many of the workers, numbers of the peasants, and above all most of the intelligentsia, neither share the views nor endorse the policy of the Bolsheviks? Nonetheless, a very large proportion, if not the majority, of those proletarians and peasants who take an active interest in political matters support the Bolsheviks, and the same is true of the social revolutionaries of the left. This opinion is confirmed by the fact that those who are, it is alleged, in an infinitesimal minority, though reproached with errors, deeds of violence, breaches of principle, and so on, have retained power for a considerably longer period than that for which the provisional governments of the two opening phases of the revolution hold sway. Moreover, this has taken place under conditions of almost unprecedented difficulty, throughout the terrible ordeal of the Peace of Brest-Litovsk, and in the face of the ever-present menace of famine. The anti-Bolsheviks may say what they please, but the mere use of force cannot account for the perdurability of the Soviet government, which has lasted far longer than is usual in time of revolution. No minority whose power rested only upon force could continue in such circumstances and for so long a time to sit on bayonets. Through dictatorship to democracy. The persistence of Soviet rule, which, the confident prophets assured us, could not possibly last more than a few weeks, enables us to infer with certainty that this government is supported by the broad masses of the Russian people. The Bolsheviks and the left social revolutionaries who cooperate with them constitute the stalwart framework of the Russian Revolutionary Army. Through their readiness for action, through their capacity, they inspire confidence in the masses and rally the masses to their support. The need for dictatorship shows us indeed that the number and importance of the opponents of the Soviet government must by no means be underestimated. Power must be used to repress power. Our hope is that the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry will maintain itself long enough to abolish itself when it has fulfilled its function and reached its goal. For whereas during the two opening periods of the revolution, the path of the governments led from the fine ideal of democracy to the harsh and cruel reality of dictatorship, the path of the Soviet dominion will lead from the harsh and cruel reality of dictatorship to the beautiful and realized dream of democracy. So, that is the end of the audiobook. What do you think? Leave a comment below and let's continue the discussion there. In the meantime, thanks for listening. Thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month. All of those donations are very encouraging and also materially supportive, so thank you all very much for that. If you'd like to help out but not make a financial contribution, understandable, clicking like, subscribe, click the notifications bell, maybe leave a comment even just for the algorithm. Those are all helpful. Also, sharing the video wherever you can online is helpful for putting this in front of new eyeballs and involving more people in this overall conversation about confronting capital and trying to build socialism. Whatever you do online and in your community for those purposes, thanks for doing it. Keep it up, and we'll see you in the next video.